Taoiseach, over the last 2 years, you have failed to do anything effective to help people in mortgage arrears. Over 180,000 mortgages are now in arrears in this country. And the people involved here are finding it extremely difficult to cope. And their experiences with the banks have been anything but pleasant. Now, the Keane report, Taoiseach, was published over 18 months ago, and it made many recommendations, including the idea of split mortgages, for example. But we've learned that only about 50 such mortgages have been put into operation since the publication of the Keane report, which is a damning indictment, Taoiseach, of your lack of action on this particular front. You still insist that the banks must have a veto over any resolution of mortgage arrears or household debt. You were going to go ahead and enact legislation to facilitate banks to repossess family homes. And to add insult to injury, you were going to insist that families in mortgage arrears will have to pay a badly designed property tax. And it escapes me how people in this position, in arrears on their mortgages, can't pay their mortgages, will have to pay property taxes. And people are finding this incredible indeed. Now, Senator Thomas Byrne and Deputy Michael McGrath did publish legislation in a constructive way in July of 2011, which proposed the establishment of an independent debt settlement office. You didn't take those recommendations on board. And essentially that legislation would have provided independent oversight in relation to the resolution of household debt between banks and their customers. Now, the personal insolvency bill is not operational yet, Taoiseach, and I've been asking you for over a month, can you list the sections that have been enacted? Now, in red here, Taoiseach, are all the sections of the bill that are not enacted.
Thank you.
Over 119 sections of the bill that's meant to deal with this issue remain unenacted or have not been commenced by the government. The Cabinet subcommittee on this have only met twice since last July, since its establishment.
Thank you, Deputy.
All which illustrates, Taoiseach, a lack of engagement and a lack of activity here. And the plan you're announcing today, Taoiseach, this isn't about targets, Taoiseach. This is about the quality of the restructuring that will take place between the banks and the customers in relation to their mortgages. It has to make a difference on the ground.
Question, please.
Setting targets will not help. I instanced yesterday cases in Ashbourne and elsewhere
Put your question,
where people were having obstacle after obstacle put in front of them to get a deal with the bank, and the banks were not dealing with them. So the key question is this, Taoiseach. Will there be independent oversight over the deals that the banks will strike with individuals?
Thank you.
Will there be independent oversight, Taoiseach, that has teeth and that can ensure that the quality of the restructuring that may take place will be effective and have real meaning for the people who find themselves, unfortunately, in arrears with their banks?
Taoiseach.
Well, I listened this morning to LM FM radio in part, and I heard the spokesperson for finance making the comment that the reason that the government were introducing initiatives today being set up by the Minister for Finance in regard to mortgage arrears was because of the by-election in County Meath. Did you ever hear anything as strange as that, Count Corla? And I noticed that the leader of Fianna Fáil draws the by-election into his comments here. The first thing I'd remind you is that you refused to hold by-elections yourselves because you were always afraid of the people. We had to change the law to do it within 6 months. And actually,
getting excited, it's
nothing to do with the by-election at all that this is actually going on here. Now, you know, you pursued a misery agenda for long enough, a misery agenda, and I'm not sure whether you were afraid you'd actually sort this out or not. Because when you look back at what you didn't do, it was simply appalling behaviour and lack of incompetence from a government. You ignored the fact that the government that you were a central member of was directly responsible for the infliction of the economic burdens on every single person in the country because of the way that you allowed banking systems to run riot, where people couldn't go to ATM machines, but they were getting notices you've been approved already for another 10 or 15,000 or 50,000, as the case might be. This government had to restructure the banks, recapitalise the banks, change the boards and make a whole series of arrangements, including the introduction of the Personal Insolvency Act, which is not yet operational because the Personal Insolvency Agency will open its doors in early summer. There will be an announcement about that from the director who has already been appointed, who is recruiting his staff towards the end of March. Now, Deputy Martin, the Minister for Finance will set out all of the details of the mortgage requirements, targets and timelines today with similar announcements by the central bank. The fact of the matter is that the central bank, as you know, control the licences here and can apply any conditions that they see fit to banks who do not adhere to conditions or rearrangements for mortgages for persons who are in distress. Now, I said to you yesterday that what we want to see here is an opportunity and a position where those 100,000 people who exist now for the banks, who work for the banks and who exist for their families, can have some sense of security for the future. And the variety of opportunities that now exist for restructuring and having different arrangements for those clients are what the government has been about. And the details of that will be presented by the Minister for Finance today. So it's not true for you to say that the government has shown inactivity in this. In fact, for the last 2 years, this has been one of the central issues that's been involved here. That's why we had the Keane report. That's why some of the recommendations in there have been followed through, others not to the same extent that we would like. And the Minister for Housing, Minister O'Sullivan, has been very active on a number of areas in there for mortgages to lease and mortgages to rent and split mortgages and so on.
Thank you.
So far from your approach in here to say that there's been no activity from government, the scale of the mess that you left behind you was absolutely unprecedented in the history of this country. The scale of that mess, Micheál, the scale of that mess. And they're walking in to constituency offices all over the country, and every single person knows that the reason that all of this was inflicted upon our country was incompetence by your government and by incompetence in dealing with the banks. And well, you know that.
Thank you. Deputy Martin, 1 minute, thank you.
Taoiseach,
I asked you
a very straight and I asked you a very simple question that you refused to answer yesterday and you have refused to answer today. And the simple question was, will there be independent oversight over the banks in their dealings with people in mortgage arrears?
Yes or no?
The Keane report was published 18 months ago, Taoiseach, and its recommendations have not been followed through. And 50-odd split mortgages out of 182,000 mortgages in arrears does not represent action, Taoiseach, by you or by anybody else. The Governor of the Central Bank said he was tearing his hair out. The Deputy Governor, Fiona Muldoon, said last November that the banks were not doing what they should be doing in engaging with people. Now, all the political bluster and arrogance from you won't change, will not change those basic practices. Because you talk about elections and by-elections. I would say to you, if you talk to people who are in mortgage arrears,
thanks, Deputy. Would you put
who
your
are
supplementary
working,
question,
who
please?
have salaries and who want to pay their mortgages, and who have gone to the banks and have asked the banks to do a deal with them, all they get in response is the banks putting obstacle after obstacle up. There has been no action, Taoiseach, on this front.
Thank you.
The banks were recapitalised to the tune of €9 billion to deal with mortgage impairment and mortgage difficulties. And there hasn't been engagement between the banks and the customer.
Thank you.
Now, the question I asked you again, and I'll ask it again, will there be independent oversight over the banks in their dealings with customers.
Thank you.
Because to date they have demonstrated, as is evidenced by the Governor of the Bank and the Deputy Governor of the Bank, that on their own and left to their own devices, they will not deal effectively with the people in arrears.
Thank you.
And that's why government needs
Taoiseach, will you answer the supplementary question?
to ensure that there is independent oversight over the behaviour of the banks in their dealings with people.
2 points. You failed to talk to people in mortgage distress when you had the opportunity. The answer to your question is yes. The central bank will have independent oversight of arrangements made between banks and their clients.
Thank you. Deputy Martin, thank you. Now, sorry, will you hold on a second? I called Deputy Adams. He has a right to have a say. Deputy Adams, thank you.
I just remind Fianna Fáil and the government parties that there wouldn't be a compulsion to have by-elections within 6 months if Pierce Doherty hadn't gone to court to bring that about. So the fact is, Taoiseach, that you're now 2 years in government and the number of families in mortgage arrears has almost doubled. And contrary to what you say, the government has taken a softly attitude to the banks, even yesterday, and you didn't need a report yesterday to show that the salaries of top bankers are too high, and yet you're only proposing a 10% cut. But I think the big thing is that you've given the banks a veto over any arrangements reached through the personal insolvency services. And the banks, it's clear, the record is there. They're unwilling to deal compassionately, they're unwilling to deal efficiently with citizens and mortgage arrears. Now, on top of all of that, this week, householders are receiving letters from the Revenue in relation to the tax on their family home. This is a tax designed by Fianna Fáil, now being delivered by Fine Gael and Labour. It's a very, very unfair tax. Now, Taoiseach, a little question for you. Who said Fianna Fáil's proposal, now endorsed by the Labour Party, to introduce by 2014 an annual recurring residential property tax on the family home is unfair? Who said that, Taoiseach? You said that, Taoiseach, and don't give us the guff about the North. People pay rates in the North. People pay rates. People pay rates. People pay rates in the North, and you know this.
Sorry, would you hold on, please, hold on. I don't know whether you heard me or not. Would you allow the Deputy finish his question and then we can get on with the business?
Thank you. The fact is the deputies know that what I'm saying is accurate because people in the North pay rates for which they get services which are denied householders in this state. I'm talking about refuge collections, I'm talking about water charges, I'm talking about prescriptions, I'm talking about free school books for their children. What you have here are the largest potholes perhaps in the Western world. So look, Taoiseach, it was you who said
Could you give us a
that
question,
this property tax on the family home is unfair. So do you still accept that this is an unfair tax? And do you now accept, because if you're changing tack this afternoon, then explicitly that means that you're admitting failure thus far. So do you accept that your hands-off approach to the banks has failed miserably?
Taoiseach.
No, I don't. The property tax, as you know, will apply for this year. 65% will be retained in the local authorities. Government's intention is to get that to 80% for use for services in the local authority areas where people pay their property tax. This is a fair tax where those who have the most will pay the most, and clearly it's been set out as providing for services for people in local areas. I assume that you already pay this on the premises that you own in West Belfast, and that you will pay it on the house you have in Donegal, and you have another one up in County Louth, I assume. So you'll be a multiple property taxpayer, being compliant with the law of the land, and I'm sure you won't object to that. for the provision of services in your own area. In respect of the mortgages, as I said, Minister for Finance will outline the details of that this afternoon. Let me say to you that the banks don't have a veto here. The banks have no veto over the insolvency legislation. They had no veto over the reduction of the bankruptcy scale from 12 years to 3 years, and they don't have a veto over the insolvency legislation introduced by the government. And that's why it's an incentive for banks to sit down with clients and deal with their particular problems throughout the wide variety of opportunities that there are there that have been outlined both in the Keane report and in other opportunities for people to restructure and re-engineer their particular mortgage distress problems. I might say that the rant that you've been on about everybody being evicted and houses being repossessed, was just nonsense. And I noticed that even your own spokesman on finance, when pressurised by in an interview recently, did say that repossessions would be applicable in a case, in small numbers of cases, which is what everybody understands, where no effort is being made to repay mortgages where they could be repaid. So the situation, Deputy Adams, is that for the property tax, 65% this year, rising to 80%, will be retained in the local authorities for the provision of services and infrastructure in those areas where people actually pay it.
Deputy Adams, thank you.
Well, Taoiseach, first of all, we need to deal with the substance of these issues. Well, for a man from Mayo to even suggest that repossessions of a family home, that evictions, even if it's a small number of citizens from the family home, would in any way be justifiable is totally and absolutely reprehensible. Now, rather than jibing at us, deal with the substance. 1 in 4 mortgage holders are in distress. People have had tax upon tax upon tax imposed upon them. They can't pay it. That's the reality of the situation. What we have argued for is for a statutory independent body to impose settlements which would be legally binding agreements between the mortgage holders and the banks, including, and you have ruled this out, including where appropriate write-downs. That's dealing with the substance of the problem. You do have a veto and have given that veto to the banks. You should remove that veto from the banks. And you have waited time and time and time when I have asked you across this chamber. You've said the regulator doesn't want us to intervene. We can't do anything about it. You've done very, very little of substance to put manners on the banks. And what you have to do, and I look to the Minister of Finance also, you have to put the whole issue of a family's right to a home on a legislative footing.
Thank you.
That has to be done by this government. The assurance that you haven't given needs to be given now. And stand up clearly. Don't wait, Taoiseach, until this afternoon. Stand up clearly and say that there will be no forced repossessions of families from the family home.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Yes, I do understand the history and the tradition that you refer to. In fact, the story is from my part of the country back in history when one of the great initiators of the agrarian movement when evicted from the family home at Strayed obviously was Michael Davitt. I understand that, Deputy Adams, very well indeed. But no intention of it. But I mean, on this week on March the 11th.
Sorry, would you please?
On March the 11th, your own spokesman on finance.
Would you
your
please?
own spokesman on finance, when asked a question on a national radio programme, in the case of the family home, should it ever be an option? Yes, he said, it should be an option, only in the extreme, and there has to be legal protection and legislative protection that a bank cannot swoop in and purchase a home. For example, if somebody's out there who has an ability to pay their mortgage but is deciding not to pay their mortgage, then yes, that option has to be available to the bank. And secondly, the question was, so you're not ruling it out? And the answer from Sinn Féin was only for somebody who is completely defaulting on their mortgage, who has an ability to pay, that repossession could apply. So don't come in here and say that you suddenly have a new version of what your own spokesman said this week on the 11th of March. I want to make it perfectly clear, Deputy Adams. The government want to see a fair and a transparent process here for dealing with mortgages. What we want to do is get the 100,000 people who are in mortgage arrears and mortgage distress to a point where they can have the psychological relief that their home is not being taken from them, that they contribute to their local economy and have a life to live. And that's the reason that the Minister for Finance and the government, working with the central bank, have put all these arrangements in place that will be announced today, that targets and timelines will be set by banks who now have trained staff to deal with these particular circumstances that are unique in each case. And family home repossessions are the very end of that line and the very last resort. Nobody in here wants to see that happen. But in these cases, even from your own party, you recognise that there are a very small number where this is going to have to apply. That's always been. The Family Home Protection Act is constitutionally legislated for already, and of course property rights in the Constitution are protected for every citizen. So, Deputy Adams, the point here is that what's happening today is part of the strategy and the process of restructuring banks, of recapitalising banks, providing alternatives through the Personal Insolvency Agency, which will open its doors shortly, of having a variety and a multitude of ways that banks can sit down with their clients and work out a more appropriate, a more convenient and a more suitable arrangement for those people who, for whatever reason, have gotten into distress or arrears in order to rectify the position. Everybody wants to see the economy move on here, and this is a problem, and government have put in place structures over the last 2 years which will be detailed today by the Minister for Finance when he speaks on this matter.